They are afraid not of artillery, not of aircraft, not of the slow grinding advance of armor. They are afraid of something far smaller, something that makes no sound at all, something that one German field report from this period described simply as the shadow weapon. What they fear is a blade, a British blade, and the knowledge that if it finds them in the dark, they will never hear it coming. Imagine being handed a knife, just a knife, and told that it has made elite German soldiers refuse orders, that it caused SS commanders to limit night patrol duties, that it traveled in the hands of agents dropped behind enemy lines, commandos slipping through the dark, and resistance fighters who had to remain invisible or die. Imagine that this knife, with its slender profile and distinctive double-edged blade, became so feared that the Germans gave it a name of their own. They called it the stiletto of the British secret killers. This is the story of the Fairbairn-Sykes Fighting Knife, one of the most purpose-built close combat weapons ever designed, and it begins, as so many British military innovations do, not in a laboratory or a government office, but in the chaotic, blood-soaked streets of Shanghai. To understand why Britain needed a knife at all, a specific, purpose-engineered knife designed not for utility but purely for killing, you have to understand the peculiar problem that confronted British special operations in the early years of the Second World War. By 1940, the situation was, by any rational assessment, desperate. France had fallen. The British Expeditionary Force had been evacuated from Dunkirk, leaving behind staggering quantities of equipment. Occupied Europe stretched from Norway to the Spanish border, and yet Winston Churchill, in one of his more audacious strategic moments, had directed that Britain would fight back, not solely with conventional forces, but through sabotage, subversion, and what the official documents of the time euphemistically called irregular operations. The Special Operations Executive, established in July 1940, was charged with setting occupied Europe ablaze, in Churchill's own words. Its agents would be dropped into enemy territory, sometimes alone, sometimes in small groups. They would live among civilian populations, work with resistance networks, blow up railway lines, gather intelligence, and, when circumstances demanded, kill, quietly, without alarm, without witnesses. The problem was that the tools available for such work were wholly inadequate. Standard British service knives of the era were utility instruments, heavy, broad-bladed things designed for cutting rope or opening ration tins. They were emphatically not designed for the controlled, precise application of lethal force in conditions of darkness and silence. American OSS agents faced similar problems. The Germans, for all their military sophistication, had never developed a standardized close combat blade for their special operatives at all. The gap was real, urgent, and potentially lethal for any agent sent into the field. What was needed was something quite specific, a blade light enough to carry concealed for weeks, balanced perfectly for a thrusting motion rather than a slashing one, slender enough to penetrate heavy winter clothing, and, crucially, psychologically authoritative. An agent who carried it needed to feel that the instrument in their hand was precisely right for the work it might be called upon to do. The question was, who on earth could design such a thing? The answer, improbably but appropriately, was two retired policemen from one of the most dangerous cities on earth. William Ewart Fairbairn and Eric Anthony Sykes had spent the better part of 2 decades policing the international settlement in Shanghai during the 1920s and 1930s. Shanghai in that era was a city of extraordinary violence, a port city teeming with criminal gangs, political factions, desperate refugees, and every species of organized brutality that the 20th century could produce. Fairbairn, in particular, had been involved in an estimated 600 street encounters during his time there. He had been stabbed, beaten, and shot at. He had studied judo, jiu-jitsu, boxing, and wrestling. He had developed, refined, and systematized a fighting system that stripped away all sporting pretension and focused on a single, unambiguous objective: incapacitating or killing an opponent as rapidly as possible. When the two men were brought to Britain and attached to the Special Operations Executive, and later the Commando training establishment at Achnacarry in Scotland, they brought with them a knowledge of close-quarters violence that no one else in the British military possessed, and they brought with them an idea for a knife. The Fairbairn-Sykes Fighting Knife, the FS knife as it became universally known, was designed in 1941 in collaboration with the Sheffield cutlery firm of Wilkinson Sword. The choice of manufacturer was significant. Wilkinson had been producing edged weapons for the British military since the Napoleonic era, and they possessed both the metallurgical expertise and the precision tooling to realize Fairbairn and Sykes's exacting specifications. The blade itself measured approximately 17.5 centimeters, roughly 7 inches, in length and was double-edged along its entire length, a feature that distinguished it immediately from virtually every other military knife then in production. This double edge was not decorative. It was functional in a very specific sense. It meant that the blade could wound on both the thrust and the withdrawal, and it meant that the knife could be used effectively regardless of which way the wrist was oriented in the dark. When you cannot see, when your hands may be shaking, when every second counts, you cannot afford to think about blade orientation. The FS knife eliminated that variable. The profile of the blade was slender and foil-like, tapering to a needle point. It was designed primarily as a thrusting weapon, the thrust being demonstrably more reliably lethal than the slash in close-quarters combat, particularly against a clothed opponent. The point could penetrate the gaps between ribs. It could reach the organs. It required far less physical strength than a slashing motion, which mattered enormously when an agent might be cold, exhausted, or operating in a confined space where a broad swing was impossible. The grip was perhaps the knife's most immediately recognizable feature: an oval cross-section handle, typically produced in brass, with a series of rings cast into its surface to prevent the hand from slipping even when wet with rain or blood. The grip was sized to fit comfortably in the hand without being gripped tightly, allowing for the controlled, directed stabs that Fairbairn's training manuals described in clinical, almost academic detail. The total weight of the knife was approximately 225 grams, 8 ounces, roughly equivalent to a large apple, light enough to be forgotten on the person, heavy enough to have substance and balance in the hand. The balance point was positioned slightly forward of the guard, which made the blade feel, in Fairbairn's own phrase, alive in the grip. If you're finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It keeps this kind of detailed historical work coming. The FS knife entered operational use through multiple channels, almost simultaneously. British Commandos received it as standard equipment from the earliest raids on occupied Europe. Number 3, Commando carried them during the Vargso raid of the 27th of December, 1941, one of the first major British amphibious assaults of the war. SOE agents parachuted into France, the Netherlands, Norway, and Yugoslavia, with FS knives strapped to their legs beneath civilian clothing. The knife became standard issue for the Special Air Service, as that regiment found its distinctive identity in the deserts of North Africa. Specific operational accounts from SOE's archives, many of which remained classified until the 1990s, and some of which remain partially redacted today, describe the knife being used in circumstances that stretch the imagination. Agents neutralize sentries in French farmhouses. Resistance fighters used them in circumstances where a gunshot would have brought a German patrol down on an entire network. One account from a circuit operating in the Dordogne region, declassified in 1997, describes a situation in which an agent used an FS knife to resolve an encounter with a Gestapo informant in a way that left no forensic trace and raised no alarm. The psychological effect on German forces in occupied territories is harder to quantify precisely, but the documentary evidence that exists is striking. German field reports from France, the Netherlands, and Norway from 1942 onwards make repeated reference to silent British attacks and express frustration at the inability to predict or prevent them. Several reports specifically mention the discovery of FS knives on captured or killed agents and describe them in terms that suggest genuine unease. By 1943, SS commanders in some occupied areas had restricted solo night patrol duty, a significant operational concession to the fear that a knife and a trained man could inspire. The Germans, for their part, attempted several equivalents. The Wehrmacht's standard fighting knife, the Kampfmesser, was a broad, single-edged blade of reasonable quality but fundamentally different design philosophy. It was a general-purpose field knife that could fight, rather than a fighting knife that happened to be portable. The Waffen-SS produced their own variants, and some German special operations units were equipped with captured Allied knives or locally sourced equivalents. But no German equivalent achieved the combination of purpose-specific design, standardized training doctrine, and mass production that made the FS knife so effective. The American OSS, the wartime predecessor of the CIA, initially equipped its agents with a variety of knives, including some British FS knives, provided through Lend-Lease arrangements. The Americans subsequently developed their own close combat knife, the V-42 Stiletto, designed specifically for the OSS and the 1st Special Service Force. The V-42 was, in many respects, a direct response to the FS knife's influence. It shared the double-edged, thrusting-oriented blade philosophy and the emphasis on penetration over slashing. American Special Forces veterans who used both generally regarded the V-42 as marginally superior for pure thrusting work, but acknowledged that the FS knife's simpler design made it more reliable under extreme field conditions. What neither the Germans nor the Americans ever quite replicated was the combination of the knife with the specific training doctrine that Fairbairn and Sykes developed. Their 1942 manual, Scientific Self-Defense, and Fairbairn's earlier Get Tough, presented a system of knife use so stripped of sentiment and so focused on anatomical reality that it remains studied in military close combat circles to this day. The knife without the knowledge was merely a blade. The knife with the knowledge was a weapon system. Assessing the true historical impact of the Fairbairn-Sykes Fighting Knife requires a degree of honesty about what can and cannot be known. The nature of the operations in which it was most frequently used, clandestine, unacknowledged, frequently improvised, means that a complete operational record will never exist. Many uses of the FS knife were never documented at all. Many that were documented remain classified. Many agents who carried them did not survive the war to provide testimony. What can be said with confidence is this: the FS knife was, for its intended purpose, an exceptional piece of design. It was purpose-built with unusual clarity of vision, produced to a consistent standard in large numbers, and accompanied by a training system that maximized its effectiveness. It arrived at a moment when it was genuinely needed. and it served that need across multiple theatres, multiple services, and multiple allied nations. Its legacy is visible in the design of close combat knives produced by virtually every major military power in the decades that followed. The principle of the double-edged, needle-pointed thrusting blade, which Fairbairn and Sykes did not invent but codified and standardized for modern military use, became the template against which subsequent designs were measured. The modern British Forces Commando knife traces a direct lineage to the FS. So do numerous American, Canadian, and Australian Special Forces knives. For those who wish to see surviving examples, the Imperial War Museum in London holds several variants, including early Wilkinson sword first pattern examples. The National Army Museum in Chelsea has further examples, as does the Special Forces Club in Knightsbridge, whose collection, not generally open to the public, represents one of the most complete assemblages of SOE-era equipment in private hands. Auction houses in London regularly see FS knives come to market, and values for confirmed wartime examples in good condition frequently exceed several £100s, a reflection both of their historical significance and of the enduring fascination they inspire. Return, for a moment, to that railway depot outside Lyon. 14 November 1942. Two SS sentries pacing in the dark. They do not know the names Fairbairn and Sykes. They do not know about a cutlery firm in Sheffield or a training establishment in the Scottish Highlands. They do not know about the precise geometry of a double-edged blade or the careful calibration of a brass grip, or the training manuals that described in cool, methodical prose exactly how a man might be silently incapacitated. They know only what their commanders have told them, that the British have agents out there, that those agents carry something dangerous, and that the danger is greatest in the dark, when no one can see. That fear, specific, visceral, impossible to entirely suppress, was itself a form of victory. Every German sentry who hesitated before stepping into darkness, every SS commander who restricted night patrol duties, every occupying soldier who slept a little less soundly because of what might be moving unseen beyond the perimeter, all of them were responding, whether they knew it or not, to a design decision made in Sheffield by two retired policemen from Shanghai. The Fairbairn-Sykes Fighting Knife weighed 225 grams. It was 17.5 centimeters of Sheffield steel. It required no batteries, no fuel, no complex mechanism. It asked only that the hand which held it had been properly trained, and the mind behind that hand was prepared for what the dark might demand. In those terms, in the terms that actually matter in war, it was, and remains, one of the most effective weapons ever produced by the British military, not because it was complicated, but precisely because it was not.